The wind howled through the canyon, carrying the bitter scent of wet pine and impending snow. Maeve stood in the frozen mud, her wool coat soaked through, her pockets lined with nothing but lint. She'd run out of road, run out of pride. The saloon doors swung shut, locking her out in the killing cold. That's when the giant of a man with eyes like chipped flint stopped his wagon. He didn't offer salvation. He just looked at her trembling shoulders, spat into the dirt and grunted, "Come home and eat supper." The mud in Bitter Creek didn't just coat your boots, it swallowed them. Maeve shifted her weight, feeling the icy slush seep through the cracked sole of her left shoe. It was a vicious, creeping cold that climbed up her ankles and settled deep in her shins. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, but the fabric was threadbare, smelling of wet sheep and desperation. Across the street, the mercantile's heavy wooden door slammed shut. The slide of the iron bolt echoed like a gunshot in the thinning twilight. Maeve stared at the window. The warm, yellow glow of the oil lamp inside was extinguished a second later. She was alone. She pressed her back against the rough, splintered siding of the assay office. The wood was damp, offering no warmth, only a windbreak against the gale tearing down the mountain pass. She dug her fingernails into the palms of her hands. She wasn't going to cry. Crying burned energy, and she had none left to spare. It had been 2 days since the stagecoach left her behind. 2 days since she realized the leather purse tucked into her bodice had been slit open and emptied by the very woman who had offered her a peppermint stick at the last station. A stray dog trotted past, its ribs showing through a matted coat. It didn't even look at her. It knew better than to expect anything from a ghost standing in the sleet. Down the boardwalk, heavy boots struck the planks. A rhythmic, unhurried thud. Maeve shrank back into the shadows. In a mining town like this, a lone woman in the dark was prey. She slipped her right hand into her coat pocket, wrapping her frozen, numb fingers around the heavy brass handle of a letter opener. It was dull, useless, really, but it was metal, and it was hers. The man stepped off the boardwalk and into the muck of the street. He was enormous, entirely out of proportion with the stunted, wind-whipped pines that surrounded the town. He wore a heavy buffalo hide coat, the fur patchy and worn down to the cracked leather at the elbows. A slouch hat was pulled low over his eyes. He wasn't looking at her. He was wrestling a 50-pound sack of grain into the back of a battered buckboard wagon, hitched to 2 miserable-looking mules. The mules snorted, their breath pluming white in the freezing air. The man tossed the sack over the tailgate. It hit the wooden bed with a heavy, dead thump. Maeve shivered. A violent, full-body spasm that rattled her teeth. The man stopped. He turned his head. Maeve held her breath, gripping the letter opener tighter. His face was a landscape of coarse brown hair and weathered skin, creased deeply at the corners of his eyes. He didn't look malicious. He didn't look kind, either. He looked completely indifferent. He reached into the back of the wagon, pulled a heavy canvas tarp over the supplies, and tied it down with thick, calloused hands. The coarse rope rasped against the iron cleats. "Store's closed," he said. His voice sounded like 2 rough stones grinding together. "I know," Maeve forced out. Her voice was thin, reedy. It lacked the haughty finishing school polish she usually relied on as armor. The man finished the knot. He didn't move to get into the driver's seat. He just stood there in the mud, letting the sleet gather on the brim of his hat. He looked at her ruined leather shoes, the hem of her skirt caked in frozen muck, and the violent shaking of her shoulders. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where her husband was, or why she was standing outside a closed store in a blizzard. "You're going to freeze to death against that wall." "I'll manage," Maeve lied, her jaw tight. The man snorted, a brief exhale of breath that might have been a laugh if it carried any humor. He walked around to the front of the wagon, checking the mules' harnesses. Suit yourself. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Maeve's chest. He was leaving. The last living soul on the street was leaving, and she was going to die here. The realization wasn't dramatic or tearful. It was just a heavy, sinking stone in her gut. She took a step forward, her boot tearing free from the mud with a wet, sucking sound. Wait. The man paused, his hand on the reins. He looked back at her, Maeve's throat convulsed. The words tasted like ash. I don't have anywhere to go. The wind kicked up, howling through the slats of the boardwalk, throwing a handful of ice crystals against her cheek. They stung like tiny needles. The man watched her for a long, agonizing moment. He didn't soften. His gaze was analytical, assessing a stray animal. Then he let go of the reins and walked back to the tailgate. He unlatched it, letting it drop with a clatter. "Come home and eat supper," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a gentle invitation. It was a directive. Maeve stared at him. She thought of the letter opener in her pocket. She thought of the stories of men in the mountains, men who hadn't seen civilization in years. But then the wind bit through her wet clothes again, sinking straight into the marrow of her bones. If he killed her, at least it would be indoors. She dragged herself toward the wagon. The wagon bed smelled of raw, wet canvas, axle grease, and the sharp, metallic tang of cold iron. Maeve huddled in the corner, wedged between a crate of what smelled like dried apples and the sack of grain. The man, he hadn't offered a name, and she hadn't asked, had tossed her a stiff woolen blanket before climbing into the driver's seat. It smelled heavily of wood smoke and old sweat, but she wrapped it around herself like a second skin. The journey was a brutal, bone-jarring ordeal. The buckboard lacked springs, and every rock, every rut in the frozen mountain trail transmitted a sharp shock straight up her spine. She kept her eyes fixed on the broad, immovable back of the man driving. He sat stoic, shoulders hunched against the driving snow, occasionally clicking his tongue or slapping the leathers against the mule's rumps. They were climbing. The air grew thinner, the cold more absolute. The pine trees pressed close against the sides of the trail, their branches heavy with snow, occasionally scraping against the canvas tarp with a sound like tearing fabric. Maeve's initial relief faded, replaced by a creeping, paranoid dread. She was entirely at his mercy. He could stop the wagon right now, drag her into the trees, and leave her for the wolves. No one in Bitter Creek knew she existed. No one would look for her. Her fingers nervously traced the cold brass of the letter opener through the fabric of her coat. It was a pathetic comfort, but she gripped it until her knuckles ached. "Who are you?" she asked, the words snatched away by the wind the moment they left her mouth. She didn't think he heard her. A moment later, he spoke without turning around. "Boone." "I'm Maeve," she offered, her voice shaky. He didn't reply. They rode in silence for another hour. The sleet turned to heavy, fat flakes of snow, blanketing the trail and muffling the sound of the mule's hooves. The darkness was absolute, save for a small kerosene lantern swinging erratically from the side of the wagon box, casting long, distorted shadows against the tree trunks. Maeve's teeth chattered violently. Her feet were completely numb. She tried to wiggle her toes inside her soaked boots, but felt nothing. Panic flared again. Frostbite. If she lost a foot, she was as good as dead. A crippled woman with no money in the West was a corpse breathing borrowed air. Are we close?" she asked, hating the pathetic waver in her voice. "Mules smell the barn," Boone replied. 10 minutes later, the trees broke. The wagon lurched into a small clearing. Through the curtain of falling snow, Maeve saw the dark, squared-off shape of a cabin. It wasn't much more than logs chinked with mud and a sharply pitched roof, but a thin ribbon of smoke was lazily curling from the stone chimney. Boone pulled back on the reins. "Whoa!" He climbed down, his boots crunching heavily in the snow. He walked to the back of the wagon and dropped the tailgate. "Get down," he said. Maeve tried to stand, but her legs were utterly useless. Her knees buckled the moment she put weight on them. She grabbed the side of the wagon, gasping as her frozen muscles protested. Boone sighed. It was a heavy sound of mild inconvenience. He stepped closer, reaching up and wrapping two massive hands around her waist. His grip was entirely functional, devoid of any gentleness, like he was moving a sack of feed. He lifted her out of the wagon and set her on the snowy ground. Her legs gave out immediately. Before she could hit the snow, Boone caught her by the arm. His grip was like a vice, bruising her bicep through the wool of her coat. "Feet don't work," he muttered, assessing the situation. Without another word, he scooped her up. One arm under her knees, the other around her back. Maeve gasped, instinctively throwing her arms around his thick neck to steady herself. He smelled powerfully of wet wool, pine pitch, and the faint, coppery scent of dried blood on his sleeve. He didn't struggle under her weight. He carried her up the 3 wooden steps to the porch, kicked the heavy slab door open with his boot, and carried her inside. The darkness of the cabin was heavy, smelling of cold ash and stale tobacco. Boone deposited her unceremoniously into a high-backed wooden rocking chair near the stone hearth. The sudden removal of his body heat left her shivering even harder. "Take your boots off," he commanded, striking a match against the stone fireplace. Maeve fumbled with her frozen laces, her fingers completely unresponsive. She watched him touch the match to a pile of kindling already laid in the grate. The yellow flame licked at the dry moss, then caught the pine twigs. The smell of wood smoke instantly filled the room. Boone turned back to her, watching her struggle with the wet leather knots. He crossed the room, knelt in front of her, and swatted her hands away. Maeve stiffened, her breath catching in her throat as a stranger's massive hands wrapped around her ruined shoes. But he didn't linger. He worked the wet knots with surprising dexterity, peeling the soaked leather away from her feet. Her stockings were saturated and freezing. He pulled those off too. Maeve squeezed her eyes shut, mortified by the intimacy of it, by the pale, icy blue color of her toes. "Don't put 'em near the fire," Boone said, standing up and tossing her wet boots toward the door. "They'll thaw too fast. Hurts like a son of a bitch." He walked over to a heavy oak table, striking another match to light an oil lamp. The golden light flared, revealing the cabin. It was fiercely pragmatic. A heavy cast-iron stove in the corner, shelves lined with jars of preserved goods, animal traps hanging from the rafters. A single, narrow cot against the far wall covered in a heavy bear hide. There was only one bed. Maeve swallowed hard, wrapping her arms around her knees, trying to draw her bare, freezing feet away from the direct heat of the growing fire. Boone didn't look at her. He grabbed a heavy iron skillet from a hook, set it on the grate over the fire, and walked to a wooden larder. "Said you'd get supper," he muttered. "Ain't much, but it's hot." The sound of thick-cut salt pork hitting the hot iron skillet was the loudest thing in the room. It hissed and popped, sending tiny droplets of hot grease into the fire, making the flames flare bright orange. Maeve sat in the rocking chair, her entire body rigid. As her extremities slowly began to thaw, a deep, burning ache replaced the numbness. It felt like someone was driving hot needles into the soles of her feet and the tips of her fingers. She clenched her jaw, refusing to make a sound, watching Boone cook. He moved with an economy of motion that only comes from years of solitude. He didn't waste a single step. He sliced half an onion with a wicked-looking hunting knife, the blade flashing in the firelight, and scraped the pieces into the rendering fat. The sharp, pungent smell of the onion hitting the grease hit Maeve's stomach like a physical blow. Her stomach cramped violently, letting out a loud, hollow rumble. Boone didn't look up, but he reached into a tin canister, pulled out a handful of dried beans, and tossed them into a small iron pot, adding water from a bucket by the door. He set the pot on the edge of the coals. "Takes a while to boil," he said quietly. "I can wait," Maeve rasped. She lied. She felt like she could eat the leather of her boots. It had been nearly 48 hours since she'd had anything more than a handful of snow. Boone took a thick, stale loaf of bread from a cloth sack. He cut 2 thick slices, dropping them straight onto the hot stones near the edge of the fire to toast. Maeve watched him. She looked for a tell, a glance at her exposed ankles, a lingering stare, anything that would indicate what he wanted from her. Men always wanted something. Her father had wanted obedience. Her former fiancé had wanted a pretty ornament for his parlor. The men in the mining camps wanted flesh. Boone seemed to want nothing. He stared at the bubbling fat in the skillet. After 10 agonizing minutes, he used a rag to lift the skillet off the fire. He grabbed 2 battered tin plates from a shelf, slid a piece of charred bread onto each, and dumped half the greasy pork and onions over the bread. He walked over and handed her a plate and a fork. The heat radiating from the tin burned her palms, but she didn't let go. She looked down at the food. It wasn't a delicate meal. It was heavy, greasy, and smelled like heaven. Boone took his plate, sat on a heavy wooden stump on the opposite side of the hearth, and began to eat. He didn't look at her to see if she liked it. He just shoveled the food into his mouth with blunt efficiency. Maeve tried to take a polite bite. She picked up a piece of the pork with her fork, brought it to her mouth, and chewed. The hot grease coated her tongue, salty and rich. Her control snapped. She forgot the finishing school. She forgot the posture lessons. The primal, desperate animal inside her took over. She practically tore at the bread, shoving the pork and onions into her mouth, chewing fast and swallowing hard. She burned the roof of her mouth, the blister forming instantly, but she didn't care. She used her fingers to wipe the remaining grease from the tin plate, licking them clean. When she was finished, her plate spotless, she sat back, breathless. Her stomach felt heavy, achingly full, a dull warmth finally radiating outward from her core. She looked up. Boone was watching her. His own plate was resting on his knee, half-eaten. He was staring at her with those pale, flinty eyes. Maeve felt a flush of deep humiliation crawl up her neck. She lowered her gaze, wiping her mouth with the back of her wrist, realizing her chin was slick with grease. I'm sorry. I was hungry," Boone finished for her. He looked back at his plate and took another bite. "Ain't a sin to be hungry." The silence returned, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the wind throwing snow against the window panes. Maeve set her empty plate on the floor. The warmth of the room, combined with the heavy food in her stomach, was making her eyelids unbearably heavy. The exhaustion of the past 2 days was catching up to her, dragging her down like an undertow. She looked at the single cot in the corner of the room. Then she looked back at Boone. Where do I sleep?" she asked, her voice tight. This was the moment, the price for the ride and the supper. Boone stood up. He set his plate on the table, walked over to a cedar chest at the foot of his bed, and opened it. He pulled out a massive, heavy quilt made of mismatched fabric squares. He walked back to her and tossed it onto her lap. It was heavy enough to knock the breath out of her. "Chair," he said, "or the floor near the hearth. Floor's harder, but it's warmer." Maeve blinked. "And you?" "My bed," he said, stating the obvious. He walked over to the door, checked the heavy iron bolt, and then walked to the lamp. He blew it out, plunging the room into darkness, save for the orange glow of the dying fire. Maeve heard the rustle of clothing, the heavy creak of the rope springs on the cot, and then the sound of Boone settling in. She sat in the rocking chair, clutching the heavy quilt to her chest. She listened to the wind outside. She listened to the deep, even breathing of the massive man in the dark across the room. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't asked for a thing. For the first time since she stepped off that stagecoach, Maeve felt a tear break loose. It slid down her cheek, hot and fast, cutting a track through the dirt and soot on her face. She pulled the quilt over her head, curled into a tight ball in the wooden chair, and cried silently into the dark. It wasn't out of fear. It was the overwhelming, terrifying realization that, for tonight at least, she was safe. Morning did not arrive with a gentle dawn. It hit the frost-caked windows like a broadside of blinding, dead-white glare. Maeve woke with a sharp intake of breath, her neck cramped at a vicious angle against the hard wooden back of the rocking chair. For 3 seconds, she didn't know where she was. She smelled sharp chicory coffee, old leather, and the heavy, metallic scent of cold ash. Then the dull throb in her feet registered, and the memory of the muddy street in Bitter Creek crashed down on her. She opened her eyes. The cabin was freezing. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers, throwing just enough heat to keep the water bucket by the door from freezing solid. Boone was already awake. He sat at the heavy oak table, his massive back to her, working a whetstone in slow, rhythmic circles over the curved blade of a hatchet. Scrape! Shh! Scrape! Shh! The sound set her teeth on edge. Maeve moved, and her joints cracked like dry kindling. Her body felt bruised, battered by the stagecoach, the freezing mud, and the unyielding chair. She pulled the heavy, mismatched quilt tighter around her shoulders, shivering as the cold morning air hit the damp, sweat-stained collar of her dress. Boone didn't turn around. "Coffee's on the stove. Grounds are thick. Chew 'em if you want to." His voice was a low gravel rumble, completely devoid of morning pleasantries. Maeve gingerly stood up. Her feet screamed in protest. The flesh was tender, swollen, and mottled purple. She took a tentative step onto the freezing floorboards, wincing as a sharp pain shot up her heel. She limped to the cast-iron stove. A battered blue enamel pot sat on the warming plate. She poured a cup, the dark liquid sludging into the tin mug. She took a sip. It was brutally bitter, tasting of burnt wood and cheap chicory, but it was hot. It sent a vital, burning trail down her throat to her stomach. She stood there, clutching the mug with both hands, letting the steam warm her nose. She looked down at herself. Her dress, once a respectable navy wool, was ruined, caked in dried mud at the hem, wrinkled beyond repair, smelling of wet sheep and unwashed bodies. Her hair, which she usually kept pinned in tight, neat coils, hung in greasy, tangled strands around her face. She felt a sudden, violent surge of shame. In her old life, she wouldn't have let a servant see her like this, let alone a man. She had been raised to be an immaculate porcelain doll, right up until the creditors came and the porcelain shattered. Now, she was a beggar in a filthy dress, drinking mud water in a stranger's shack. "I need to—" Maeve started, her voice raspy from disuse. She stopped, the humiliation burning her cheeks. She had to relieve herself, and the thought of asking this giant where to go made her stomach twist. Boone paused the whetstone. He pointed the handle of the hatchet toward the back corner of the room, near his cot. "Curtain. Pot's behind it. Don't go outside. Wind's picking up. You'll lose your way 10 feet from the door and freeze." Maeve stared at the canvas curtain, hung on a sagging wire. The degradation was absolute, but her bladder was aching. She limped over, pulled the stiff canvas aside, and handled her business in agonizing, mortifying silence. She prayed the howling wind outside masked the sounds. When she emerged, she felt a profound, heavy exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. Boone hadn't moved. He was testing the edge of the hatchet against the rough pad of his thumb. Maeve walked back toward the stove. She wanted to be useful. She needed to earn her space, lest he change his mind and throw her back out into the snow. She reached for the heavy iron handle of the skillet he'd used last night, intending to scrape the congealed grease. Her fingers, still numb and clumsy, slipped, The heavy iron pan hit the floorboards with a deafening clang. Maeve jumped, a hard flinch that sent a jolt of panic through her chest. "I'm sorry," she gasped, dropping to her knees to grab the handle. "I'm sorry, I was just trying to—" "Leave it!" Boone snapped. Maeve froze on the floor. Her breath hitched. She waited for the blow, or the yell, or the curse. The men she knew threw things when they were interrupted. They struck out when their morning peace was broken. Boone stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. He walked over to her. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. He reached down, clamped his massive hand around her upper arm, and pulled her to her feet with zero effort. "Hands are soft," he muttered, looking at her pale, trembling fingers. "Skin's frozen. You grab a cold iron, you'll tear the hide right off your palms. Sit down." He didn't wait for her to argue. He picked up the skillet, grabbed a rag, and went to work on it himself. Maeve retreated to the rocking chair. She sat rigidly, clutching the tin mug. He hadn't hit her. He hadn't even raised his voice past a grumble. But his assessment stung worse than a slap. Hands are soft. Useless. She was entirely, completely useless in this world, and they both knew it. By noon, the blizzard hit with full, terrifying force. It wasn't just snow. It was an assault. The wind shrieked around the eaves of the cabin like a dying animal, making the heavy log walls shudder. The sky turned a suffocating, bruised gray, and the snow blew sideways, packing against the windows until the glass was completely obscured by solid white ice. The cabin, which had felt sparse and empty the night before, suddenly felt the size of a coffin. Maeve paced. 2 steps from the hearth to the table, 2 steps back. The rhythmic creak of the floorboards was the only thing keeping her grounded. Boone was fixing a broken leather harness. He sat on the floor near the stove, an awl and heavy waxed thread in his hands. He worked in complete silence, the muscle in his jaw jumping rhythmically as he pulled the thick thread tight. He had been working on it for 2 hours. He hadn't spoken a single word. The silence was making Maeve claw at her own skin. She was used to noise. The chatter of drawing rooms, the clinking of teacups, the shouting of peddlers in the street, the angry, drunken ranting of the man she had run away from. Silence, to Maeve, meant a predator was stalking. "Do you ever talk?" she demanded. The words tore out of her throat before she could stop them. Boone didn't look up. He punched the awl through the thick leather. "Shuck. Talk when there's something needs saying." "And nothing needs saying?" Maeve let out a short, jagged laugh. It sounded unhinged, even to her own ears. "We are trapped in a wooden box while the world ends outside, and you are acting like it's a sunny Tuesday in July." Boone pulled the thread through. It's just winter. Happens every year." "I am going crazy," she hissed, her hands balling into fists at her sides. She wanted him to react. She wanted him to yell, to argue, to do something human. "I am staring at a wall of ice. I smell like stale grease, and my feet feel like they are on fire." Boone finally stopped. He laid the leather harness across his knees and looked up at her. His flinty eyes tracked slowly over her trembling frame, taking in her clenched fists, her pale face, the wild tangle of her hair. "You're alive," he said flatly. "Yesterday you were fixing to die against a wall. Today you're warm enough to complain about the smell." The blunt truth of it hit her like a physical blow. The fight drained out of her instantly, leaving behind a hollow, sickening wave of shame. She swayed on her feet, the sudden drop in adrenaline making her lightheaded. Boone sighed. It was the same heavy, inconvenienced sound he'd made when her legs gave out in the snow. He tossed the harness onto the table and stood up. He walked to the cedar chest at the foot of his bed, rummaged inside, and pulled out a heavy flannel shirt. It was a faded, washed-out red, smelling of lye soap and cedar shavings. He threw it at her. It hit her in the chest, and she scrambled to catch it. "Take that wet dress off," he ordered, turning his back to her and walking to the stove. He grabbed an iron poker and started jabbing violently at the coals. "Hang it near the fire. Don't put it too close, or it'll singe." Maeve stared at his broad back. "Take my dress off? It's damp. Damp kills in this air." He didn't turn around. "Ain't looking at you. Put the shirt on." Maeve hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to keep her armor on, no matter how wet and heavy it was. But the cold dampness of the wool was seeping into her bones, bringing a deep, marrow-deep ache. She turned away from him, facing the dark corner. With trembling fingers, she fumbled with the tiny, stiff buttons down the front of her bodice. The fabric was stiff with dried mud and sweat. It took agonizing minutes, her breath catching every time the wind howled or Boone shifted near the stove. She peeled the heavy dress off her shoulders, letting it drop to the floor in a sad, wet heap. She was left in her cotton chemise and petticoats, which were equally damp and filthy. Shivering violently, she pulled Boone's flannel shirt over her head. It swallowed her. The hem hit her just above the knees, and the sleeves hung inches past her fingertips. It was rough against her skin, heavy and warm. She hurriedly rolled the sleeves up, exposing her bruised wrists, and picked up her ruined dress. She draped it over the back of the rocking chair, pulling it closer to the hearth. When she turned around, Boone was looking at her. He didn't look at her bare legs protruding from the bottom of his shirt, or the thin, damp cotton of her petticoat peeking through the unbuttoned front. He looked at her face. "Better?" he asked. Maeve pulled the collar of the shirt tighter around her neck. She felt entirely exposed, yet bizarrely safe. The shirt smelled like him, wood smoke, pine, and a clean, masculine sweat. It was an intimate, overwhelming scent. "Yes," she whispered, looking at the floorboards. "Thank you." Boone gave a short, single nod. He sat back down on the floor, picked up the awl and went back to his harness. The silence returned, but this time the teeth had been pulled from it. It wasn't a stalking predator anymore. It was just quiet. The daylight died by 3 in the afternoon, swallowed by the storm. Boone lit the oil lamp, casting long, jumping shadows across the log walls. The temperature in the cabin had dropped significantly. The wind was finding every microfissure in the mud, chinking, pushing thin blades of freezing air into the room. Maeve sat close to the stove, her knees pulled to her chest beneath the hem of Boone's massive shirt. She watched him work. He had moved from mending leather to cleaning a heavy, lever-action rifle. The smell of gun oil mixed with the wood smoke. He moved with a steady, practiced rhythm. Strip the bolt, wipe the bore, oil the mechanism. He didn't rush. He had the patience of a stone. Maeve watched his hands. They were massive, scarred, the knuckles thick and calloused. She caught sight of a thick, jagged line of pale flesh running up his left forearm, disappearing beneath the rolled sleeve of his long johns. It didn't look like a knife wound. It looked like something had tried to tear the meat from the bone. He caught her staring. He didn't cover the scar. He just kept wiping the iron barrel. "Bear," he said, his voice quiet over the wind. Maeve blinked, startled that he had initiated a conversation. "A grizzly? Cougar." Boone set the rag down. 5 years back. Caught me gutting a deer in the brush. Didn't hear her coming." Maeve looked at the scar, then up to his face. "Did you kill it?" Boone let out a dry, humorless snort. "Took half my arm and a piece of my thigh. I bled out in the snow for 3 hours before I could crawl back to my horse. Mules brought me down the mountain." He looked down at the rifle. "Cougar got the deer. I got the scar. Fair trade, I reckon." It was a terrifying story, delivered with the casual boredom of a man discussing the weather. Maeve pulled her arms tighter around her legs. "You didn't want to leave? After that? go somewhere. Safer? Boone looked at her. The oil lamp caught the amber flecks in his dark eyes. Safer where? Cities are full of men. Men are worse than cats. Cats just want to eat. Men want to own you. The word struck Maeve square in the chest. They bypassed her ribs and settled cold and heavy in her lungs. Men want to own you. She looked away.